right to defend themselves by taking out the terrorists who committed that atrocity, yes.
OK. And presumably you refuse to call Israel, and you have refused when you've been asked to call Israel a terrorist organisation, government, or the IDF a terrorist organisation.
Well, the difference is here we are. Well, hang on. In London...
No. Let me finish my question, Piers. I have a question for you.
I have given you an unequivocal answer. Now, let me ask you if you can give me one.
Yes.
Do you believe Hamas are a terror organisation?
OK, and I'd like to ask you, what does that mean?
Just answer my question.
Well, I need clarification.
Well, this country has prescribed them as a terror group. Do you think they are?
Are you the British government?
No, I'm asking you what you think.
OK, so I want a clarification.
I gave you a simple, straight answer.
What does it mean?
No, you tell me.
I don't know. You're asking me a question. You asked the question.
You don't think they are a terror group?
No, I want your definition of what is a terror group?
Terrorism is broadcasting terror as the primary tool for advancing political gain, as the primary objective. Terror might be a byproduct of many acts of violence or war. Political gain might be a byproduct of many acts of violence or war. For an act to be qualified as terrorism, the intent must be to broadcast terror as the primary tool, not as a byproduct. For political gain as the primary objective, not as a byproduct. Terrorism can only be carried out by non-state militia or lone wolves, with personal political aspirations or affiliated with a political ideology. Terrorism cannot apply, acted upon, military targets. The reason why this is the true definition of terrorism is it serves the purpose of identifying groups like Al-Qaeda, who are the reason the term terrorism was popularized after 9/11 in the first place. At the same time, it drives a clear distinction from other, often equally condemnable terms like war criminals, hate crime, the crime of genocide, or crimes against humanity. Acknowledging that words are invented by people to identify efficiently patterns in reality and not bring more confusion. Socrates Son's definition is the most specified representative of what people mean by the word terrorism, and therefore the truest definition until presented otherwise.
The true definition of terrorism is not concerned with the number of civilian casualties. Instead, is concerned with the intent to broadcast terror as the primary tool for political gain as the primary objective. The word terrorism became popular after 9/11 because people wanted to communicate a specific type of violent activism represented by Al-Qaeda. The intent was not to find a new way to accuse more efficiently people. The intent was not to put on the spot a specific group of people most responsible for terrorism, i.e. the Muslims. The only purpose of terms is to identify things in reality. Moral accusations are not inherent to words. If the definition of terrorism defeats the purpose of identifying groups like Al-Qaeda and separating them from other similar groups, that defeats the purpose of terms is no longer a definition. That's why my definition of terrorism is the most efficient, because it does exactly this. And therefore, the truest definition until someone brings something that does what I describe better.
My daughters as terrorists?
Well, I think it was appalling. And I think
Do you consider it as terrorist?
I do not consider Israel to be a terrorist organisation.
The killing of my daughters?
I think here's a question we have to ask ourselves, which is, since you have defended Israel's operation in Gaza as self-defense, and that you refuse to call Israel a terrorist organisation or a terrorist government, despite the fact that almost as many Palestinians, Gazans have died under Israel's precision bombing than as Londoners have died during the whole year of the Blitz under German bombing, which wasn't precision bombing. And yet you still say that, well, Israel isn't a terrorist organization, I think the question we should be asking is, should you be suspended? Is it responsible to have a person with your views speaking to the public when you clearly refuse to condemn that which needs to be condemned, which was worse than the London Blitz? Those that condemn with precision weapons, and the Germans didn't even have precision weapons.
Abdullah al-Andalusi, co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative, proposes a peculiar definition of terrorism. Judging from his argument, terrorism means when a military kills too many civilians. If we apply this definition, the Allies in World War II were terrorists, as their actions resulted in the deaths of many civilians, just like with Israel. Yet the true definition of terrorism is
Socrates Son's definition of terrorism.
But let's give the co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative a break. He obviously hasn't got the intellectual capacity to communicate what he actually means. What he meant was that Israel should stand condemned because the amount of civilian casualties in Gaza is more than the Blitz, the German bombing against the United Kingdom during the Second World War. The first thing to note is that the London Blitz was conducted by indiscriminate bombing, something that he also acknowledged, and didn't stop because the Nazis were concerned about civilian casualties, but because Britain stopped them. And then Britain and its allies went on and completely destroyed Germany, just like Gaza, and with less consideration for German civilians than Israel. To conclude, Abdullah Andalusi, co-founder of the Muslim Debate Initiative, doesn't understand the definition of terrorism and gives an analogy that justifies Israel and condemns his own position.
When comparing the London Blitz with Israel's Gaza bombing, we recognize qualitative differences. The Nazis had no consideration for civilians and engaged in indiscriminate bombing with the intent to maximize damage to civilian life and infrastructure. In contrast, Israel is making considerable efforts to avoid civilian casualties. British civil and military authorities took measures to protect civilian life and infrastructure. In counter-distinction, Hamas admittedly took no prevention to protect civilians as the least of their obligations. Instead, hide weapons behind civilian infrastructure, often prevent civilians from taking shelter by using them as human shields. It is noticeable how the British used the British subway for protection. Hamas didn't predict or use any of their tunnels to protect civilians. Concluding, Abdullah al-Andalusi made a false accusation. Although the bombing of Gaza might be worse than the London Blitz, in qualified parameters like a bomb's destructive power and casualties, Israel conducted the bombing of Gaza better than the Nazis the London Blitz. Hamas handled the bombing of Gaza worse than the British the London Blitz.